Hello, and welcome back to Coinscrum's Meet the Founders series. I'm delighted to be joined today by Sam Williams, co-founder and CEO at Arweave, and Phil Mataras, CEO at ArDrive. Thanks for joining us, guys.
Great to be here.
Paul.
So we're going to be talking about decentralized storage, which is what you've been developing, Sam, at Arweave. Before we dive into that in more detail, we'd just like to ask our guests what they were doing before they entered the crazy world of crypto and what sucked them in. What was it that got you in here?
Right. Well, that's an interesting question. I encountered Bitcoin for the first time in like 2010. I think the price was about 3 cents at the time. And then I really started to pay attention when the magic internet money passed $1, because that's a weird moment, right? How can this magic internet money, it's just a kind of fun, weird experiment, be worth more than the US dollar, which is, a strong, sturdy thing. I thought at the time, when I hadn't really thought through how currencies worked. So then I was pretty interested in that. In about 2012, I started mining in my university dorm room, where I didn't have to pay for electricity, and also in the university computer science department, we set up a mining operation between the machines at night that made a few satoshis.
Yep, I did my first broking deal with some guys that were doing the same, mining on their university servers. So I didn't mind.
Yeah. Well, back then it was just like a fun game. Like, hey, wouldn't it be interesting if we just turned on all these miners on these machines, because they're all just sitting idle in the middle of the night. So I guess why not was the thinking. Then I ended up investing in the Ethereum ICO with some of the tokens that I'd mined. It was only like $20 or something, but $20 back in the ICO ended up being 20,000 or something. I guess if I kept them all now, it would be nearly 80,000 or something like that. I don't know, but yeah. Then let's see. Somewhere along the line, I started doing a PhD in distributed operating system design. I was always really interested in distributed systems. Actually, more BitTorrent than Bitcoin at the beginning. I thought BitTorrent was a really, really interesting protocol with very elegant mechanism design, which nobody really ever pays attention to, but it's actually quite remarkable when you look at it carefully. Yeah, so I was building an operating system for resilient computation, you could call it. Something like, it's essentially the idea of like, what if we could make fault tolerance inside the box? So if a piece of hardware that the operating system is running on fails, can you make it so that the system continues to compute? It turns out the answer is kind of, what do you say, yes, broadly, if you do some really, really weird hacks. And that was really fun. I spent like 3 years doing that. The operating system was kind of cool. It was pretty much complete. And at the same time, there came this moment where the world was moving in a way that I would say like history was speeding up, you could say. Like the pace of change in the world of events, it was just getting faster. And it was clear that unfortunately things were moving in a sort of, whether it be left or right, authoritarian direction. Like the likelihood of centralized control over a large number of people's lives in the West was increasing, one way or another. And I've been reading a lot during my PhD, not related to my studies, but just out of interest, about like how these authoritarian regimes worked in the 20th century. So Nazi Germany and also the Soviet Union. And the one thing that was clear is that, and you actually see this in modern day China, for example, one thing that's clear is that control over information is a necessary part of the machinery. And if you don't have control over information, everything else gets a lot harder. So you can see this very clearly in China today. Like 3% of the country is party members, 3%, but they keep very tight control over the other 97%. How are they able to do that? It's very simple. You stop people being able to organize and spread ideas that you don't like. So we thought that, okay, what do you do in this situation, right? You can't solve the whole problem. No one is going to be able to solve the whole problem. It's far, far too large for any of us. But what you can do maybe is just put your skills to a small part of it, like a tiny part of it, and try and address that as best you can. And we figured that the one part of that we could address was stopping people being able to rewrite history, making it so that once remembered, always remembered. And obviously, I'd been tracking blockchains, and I was like, well, I don't know. I got a technology that's pretty good for this. kind of. So like it's global replication of data, replication of information across multiple jurisdictions is obviously the solution to this problem. Then you have to have agreement across all governments of the world that some piece of information should be illegal. And frankly, the information that all governments in the world think should be illegal, I'm kind of on board with that. That's fine by me. But you're not going to get agreement between Russia, China, and the US about pieces of information that are politically sensitive to one side. You're just going to be able to stop that political censorship. So that was the basis of it. And then we were thinking, well, it doesn't scale to put enough data inside. And there's no incentives to store the data. Once you solve that problem, you have another problem, which is there's no incentive to store this ever-growing ledger. And so the first problem we solved using a system that at the time was called proof of access. And then later we upgraded to succinct proofs of access. And now in 2 days, hard fork goes live, makes it succinct proofs of random access, which is essentially a mining system that rewards miners for having copies of the data. To start with, well, first it was just having access to the information. So you can delegate that to someone else if you want, but you had to make sure that you could access as much of the data as you could. Now it's the data is close to CPU compute. So you get that marrying of the two, which means that there's more and more replicas of the data. So there's that side of it. And then on the economic side, we came up with a system that we call the storage endowment, which actually sounds kind of magical. How can you pay for permanent storage with a single fee? Like, it just doesn't sound reasonable, but it's actually very simple. You just have a system whereby you put aside a principal, and then you generate enough interest on that principal over time that you can use the interest to pay for storage without without having to use the principal that you put up. And essentially, as long as it holds that you're generating enough interest to cover this, then the system goes indefinitely.
Cool. Okay.
And so we actually found that there's a better way to do this than just normal, like, financial, what would you say, interest-bearing, dividends or whatever it happens to be. But actually, you can just rely on the declining cost of storage, which is much, much more effective in this realm. It like declines at a rate of about 30% on average every month. And we encode in the network a declining rate of expected around 0.5%. So it's very, very high safety margin.
Okay.
And so there we go. That's kind of the story.
Well, look, thanks for that intro, and we'll definitely come back to a few of those points. And completely agree. I've always thought in terms of what these networks could be used for, and very early on, even looking at Bitcoin, and it was the idea of being able to indelibly write history would become a feature over time. And I think I've always used the example that if you look way back 1,000 years to when the Magna Carta was written, they did write 12 copies and distributed them to 12 different cathedrals around the country to ensure that it was secured, and it survived for over 1,000 years. And if they hadn't done that, you could imagine that the principles might not have survived. So it's a proven method a long time before all of this. So I'm very keen to hear a bit more. Phil, let's just come over to you, ask you the same questions, just to make it clear to our viewers. You're not a founding contributor to Arweave, but you have recognized the benefits and features of the network, and ArDrive, the project that you're developing, is something you're building on top of the Arweave network.
Exactly. And, my background is definitely a bit different than Sam's. I started out with my computer science degree, but I went into the world of consulting and kind of like enterprise IT. I managed teams of developers. I was a system admin for a long time. Deployed a lot of very centralized, heavy-duty systems, mostly focusing around collaboration, document management, storage, things like that. I've deployed an email platform or two in my time as well. But in 2017, that's when I started learning about Ethereum, and the concepts around blockchain, and like this world computer really drew me. Started mining it, went the whole route of building like a GPU miner, and it just didn't exactly click because okay, you're being a part of this network, but running all these hot GPUs, it didn't click for me, like what the purpose of that was. But then I found Arweave, and being a big fan of, decentralized networks in general, especially when it comes to, Sammy mentioned BitTorrent, things like that, being a big user. Arweave really struck me. I couldn't participate in the ICO because I'm based in the US, but I was able to look into mining it, right? And understanding, well, how the actual node works, how the technology works, because I had some, familiarity with, massively, parallelized networks and, distributed systems, but I really wanted to dig into it. So that's when I had kind of, went in, set up my first miner. I really enjoyed kind of working in the community as well. I felt like a sense of belonging with the other people there. And I was kind of, just a miner for a couple of years on the network. But then, the coronavirus came, right? It really made me change how I thought about what I did on a day-to-day basis. And, being, I guess, so passionate about what Sam and the team is trying to do about Arweave, it just made me kind of decide to really switch what I was doing, right? Leave up that kind of classic enterprise IT world, doing architecture and all this really heavy duty stuff, and build something of my own, right? So that's where we kind of took all the tools and all the patterns that Arweave kind of gives developers, and we put that into our app, ArDrive, right? And it's just a simple file sync app, right? We want it to be intuitive, easy for the users to just get their data permanently on Arweave. And that's what I've been focused on really for the last 8, maybe 10 months or so, and kind of building that out. So it's cool to be a part of the blockchain industry as opposed to just a speculator,
Yeah, exactly. Doing real things with your day. But I mean, I guess perfect example of, everyone bangs on about, things being permissionless, and, that's it. Anyone can dive in. Sam, you don't need to know the team. I mean, you get to know the team, I'm sure, but, no one needs that permission, and you just come in and build what you want. So it's another good example. And we're just seeing such an explosion of that going on across the industry right now. So Sam, I mean, we've got quite a bit to cover because, if people aren't aware of Arweave yet, they might have heard of some of the other kind of file storage projects, decentralized file storage projects such as Storage and Sire, and more recently Filecoin. You guys have been going for 3 years at least now. So, and it's not just storage you're focusing on, you're kind of building the tools for a broader ecosystem for people to, be able to develop all sorts of applications, and storage is obviously an essential part of that. So do you want to start by just talking about, I guess the foundational layer to begin with, and then we can move on and maybe discuss some of what Phil's doing and some of the other features that you have.
Yeah, so the foundational layer is the Arweave protocol, right? And it basically does something that nothing else will allow you to do, which is on-chain storage that scales. The idea is permanent information storage, I think, is one of the interesting use cases for blockchains. For what it's worth, I was an ICO investor in storage, and I still hold my tokens. I like decentralized temporary storage projects. I think they're interesting, but I don't see them as competitors, because what we're building is something that's like completely different. You just can't buy this service anywhere else. If you want to store a piece of information permanently, forever, replicate it in like hundreds, if not thousands of places across the world, then Arweave is the thing to use, and there really isn't any other competition in that area. So we just don't see it as a would you say? Yeah, we just don't see it as a competitive service to these other file storage systems, which are really just trying to compete with Amazon S3, broadly, maybe Glacier, on storage cost, which is just not the same game that we're trying to play. But on top of the Arweave base protocol layer, there's essentially this collection of protocols now which make up what we call the permaweb. And this is the key to the Arweave project, I think. At this point, it's more about the permaweb than it is the base, I would say. So the permaweb is basically all of the information stored inside the Arweave network exposed to web browsers. That's it, at like a basic level. But what this allows you to do in practice is not just store like documents and this type of thing and make it easily available to people in like mobile phones or desktop, whatever it happens to be, but also to build full applications. And that's because you can query the network as a database. Basically, there are these indexing services that allow you to ask questions like, hey, I'm looking for all the posts from this person, this user, between these timestamps. And they have this kind of app name. It's a domain, you could think of it as. And this allows you to build fully fledged, decentralized, autonomous web applications, which is just, they have a lot of pretty profound implications. Just to name one of those is this idea of ownerless cyberspace. So in cyberspace, everywhere we go is basically governed by a corporation, broadly speaking. So if I go to Google, I'm on Google's property. Google gets to decide how I access that, what I can do with it, and so on. If my access is revoked, all the rest of it. If I go to Facebook, Twitter, same deal. There's really nowhere on the internet that is public property. Yet the original premise of the internet, if you look back to what people are excited about in like the 90s, was this sort of permissionless nature of it. The idea that anyone can participate and they can say what they like or have spaces which are inhabited by people that govern themselves, broadly speaking. But that was never actually possible, it turns out, because you have these centralized servers. But what decentralized web applications allow you to do is basically take the power that was once necessary to be in a single person's hand, the server operator's hands, actually, in some cases, Phil, if you're the sysadmin, then in your hands, and put them in the collective hands of the community. And there's like a base thing you can do there. You say, okay, imagine a Twitter where there were no fundamental moderators. There was no Twitter being the moderating influence on that service. That's pretty different. But that, I think, creates environments where people don't necessarily actually want to interact that much. But you can do things on top of that. You can say, okay, you can use, for example, Arweave, which is another protocol that's built on top of the base layer. Didn't require any edits to the base layer to build, but it's a smart contracting system, which Phil now uses, for example, to express a DAO, a decentralized autonomous organization, where people stake in and gives them voting power. And you can then use a DAO, for example, to govern how this space is run. So you can elect moderators, and you can also remove moderators at any time for your community. And there's no centralized power or control over this. The community decides how they are governed. And you can also do stuff like use incentive systems on top of that to say, hey, well, everyone that wants to write in this forum has to be staked in. And so that means that you now have incentives for founders to build great communities because they get to own a bunch of the tokens up front and sell them over time. So that's just a good reward for them. But also, if you are a member of those communities that require you to stake to take part, then you can have that stake slashed if you're being a jerk. So now you have a disincentive from being an idiot. And everyone has an incentive to raise the value of the tokens. So to make the place a more productive location to be in, a more desirable location to be in. And so you can use these incentives that are expressed through the smart contracting system, which is basically built directly into this new web that we're creating together as a community. To incentivize people to act in the best ways, and also decentralize power so that nobody is the sole arbiter of what should be said and not said. So that's just one of the aspects of how these decentralized web applications change the game. There's like a ton of them, actually.
And is that a custom scripting language, or
no?
How easy is it for a kind of an existing web developer to come on and start building on Arweave?
Absurdly easy. The web applications are built in HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and if you want to build a smart contract, you can actually do it in JavaScript if you really want to. Actually, most people do. And the reason for that is because the model of execution is very different. So we use this system called lazy evaluation, which is actually something I kind of encountered first in my academic studies. It's not so well known in the programming field, but it's super useful here. Basically says, okay, so blockchains have this, they have this frustrating and annoying security model from the developer's point of view, because your code has to run on someone else's machine. So the trust model is I, the developer, write code that runs on a node's machine, which then services a user. Now, obviously, I can write whatever I want. It's going to run on everyone's machine. So of course, it has to be very safe. However, if we have a normal application in like the centralized world, the relationship is very different. It's just the developer builds something and the user decides whether they want to run it or not. That's it. And lazy evaluation allows us to essentially employ the same thing, but for smart contracts. So the user, when they want to the publisher, the developer, they deploy the contract source code and the initial state of the contract to the network, permanently stored and available. This is really what makes this whole system tick, is that like the ledger is scalable enough, you can just put as many of these as you want on the network. And then a user comes along, and then when they want to interact with it, they just write the input data to the program into the network. And it can be valid or invalid. It doesn't actually matter. The network just stores it. Then when another user wants to come along and get the state of the contract, they just execute up to the tip, or they use like a caching server or something to help them get most of the way. That's like a delegated trust situation. And there's like a whole bunch of ways you can do that. But this basic idea says, okay, well now only the developer and the user are the people running the code. And so the trust relationship is completely different. And subsequently, we can do just stuff like, for example, let people just use JavaScript. And there are now languages that compile. Obviously, you can use WASM. So it's kind of like a base language that you can easily run in a JavaScript interpreter, which means that you can run all kinds of languages on top of the system, things that are much safer than JavaScript for building smart contracts. But if you wanted to, you could just use JavaScript, and actually a lot of people do. Cool,
very cool. So with all of that, Sam's given you a bunch of tools to build on. Phil, tell us what you've done and what you saw as like, obviously when these networks are relatively new, it's quite often other people come in and are inspired and normally for their own needs, decide there's a need for something. So what was it that you kind of identified, and what have you built?
Yeah, well, as we kind of mentioned, one of the key kind of fundamental values of the network is storing files and data on there, right? Given my background, I've dealt with setting up systems for collaboration and file storage. It kind of clicked that, okay, well, maybe, Arweave can be used for something like, your Dropbox, your G Drive, that type of functionality. Lots of experience deploying OneDrive for business. So it's just, that's where my mind kind of originally went to. And that idea of like a drive that you can keep things on Arweave, I think has been around in the community since day one. People were kind of always talking about that functionality. So that's kind of what started it, right? It just, my background was kind of in that, and I saw this really unique opportunity to take advantage of a very unique network to kind of build this permanent file storage layer or application. And really the goal was to get it in the hands of everyone, right? And that was kind of another difference where a lot of, Web3 type apps, I think, are catered to a specific type of user. And what I found with Arweave is it's really easy to explain it to a non-blockchain type person, right? You store your data on a blockchain, it's permanent, you can't delete it, right? A lot of people resonate with that and understand that use case. So that's kind of the group of people we're trying to target. So it's not just about, okay, making an app that stores your data forever, but making it really easy for the person to get their files up there, making it easy to log in and manage your wallet and do those kinds of things. So, a lot of the tools that have been made available on the network, we utilize, right? Uploading and downloading our data. I'm not a developer at all, not since I graduated school. But really, the past summer, I was able to take, for example, the Arweave core JavaScript packages and make our first, MVP for ArDrive. It was just really easy to just take that because again, it's available in all these different languages. So I was able to just use that to make the first MVP. So it was quick for me to take this idea and really turn it into a product. And then once that happened, we just went full steam ahead with, okay, we have our web application. We want to deploy it on a native mobile app, a desktop app to do the watching of an actual folder so you can synchronize your data up and down. So the fact that there were these basic tools to start with, it really let the gears spin really fast and come up with the rest of ArDrive. Which again, for me, was really cool to see that in a network. And it just made it much more than just keeping your files.
Yeah. So I think something like, UX has been a big challenge since the beginning of the whole blockchain kind of story. And you're seeing some signs that it's improving. We spoke to the guys from Known Origin last week who are developed NFT marketplace, and it seems people working on the NFTs are really focusing quite strongly on UX and thinking about how do we bring in all the non-crypto guys and the other 99% of the people that aren't currently interested. So I mean, you both explained how, from a developer standpoint, Sam and the team have made it super easy to start building. What about from like the end user's perspective? Someone that's like, well, I like the idea of storage. I like how I use Dropbox or G Drive, what have you, super simple. Do I have to come in? Do I have to go to an exchange and buy tokens? Do I have to do all of that still? Or are there ways of kind of mitigating that, of passing that on to someone else, or that responsibility on someone else, just to make that, if I'm running a node on the network, if I'm mining, then of course I'm going to be kind of diving fully in and understand how I'm managing my tokens and running a node, etc. But for the end user, what does that look like?
I think Phil is actually the best person to do this because he led the effort to get fiat onboarding into the network.
Right.
So take it away.
Yeah, definitely. And there's really two pieces to it, right? So one, when you use ArDrive or any other Arweave application, you need the AR token to upload data, right? So the first challenge is making it easy for the person to get the token.
Right.
And whether that's building something to connect to exchanges or, working with companies that have payment services. And that's one of the things that we've been focusing on is, getting a nice little widget where you can use Apple Pay, Samsung Pay, credit card to just stock up your wallet, right? And really do that in a trustless way, right? We don't want to be in the business of creating wallets and giving them out and managing the keys. So getting our tokens is the first kind of piece to the puzzle. And yeah, as Sam mentioned, we have some things in the works to kind of enable this for apps that use Arweave. The second piece is their identity, right? So the wallet in this case, their private keys. So that's how we identify users in ArDrive. That's how most of the apps identify users. So how do you support users having different wallets, right? Right now, it's kind of a little tricky because you need a JSON file and you have to drag and drop it into the app to log in. So I think coming up with better solutions for that is critical. I know if you're an Ethereum user, you have something like MetaMask that lets you log in nicely to different sites. So having that kind of equivalent on the Arweave network would be really easy for that Web3 person to have their own key and seamlessly get into sites. But then what we're also seeing as well, maybe there even needs to be a level easier than that, right? Why make someone download a plugin and manage their wallet and remember to back up your seed phrase, because most people just aren't familiar with that. So we're playing around with the ideas of, well, you still have this Web 2 style login where you have a username and a password. And then you have to answer, oh, where is the wallet stored? It has to be stored somewhere in the cloud. Is it stored on Arweave itself? Is it stored somewhere, some other decentralized network? But we kind of see those two pieces as being the ultimate puzzle to get right, because once the user can get the tokens really easily and in their custody, and once they can log in with their wallet, then it's just making your app UI just really nice and flow well, and those kinds of things. So that's what we're really focused on the next few months, is getting that user login piece really nice.
Yeah,
very cool.
I
mean, so it sounds, it's just with Phil being one example, but it sounds like you're building a good and solid active community, Sam, around the network. So on the other side, yes, we want to kind of make all of this accessible and easily available to your average end user. But then on the other side, you have got a community that are more, I guess, entrenched in the inner workings of the network. And we've got a mining process, which you touched on before. Could we just go into that a little bit more, Sam, and just talk a bit more about, if someone wants to come along and contribute to the network, what that takes? Some of the other file storage networks, we won't name them necessarily, but it's quite costly to come in and start, contributing as validators on the network. What does it take if someone's coming in and exploring that side?
Let's see. You need a hard drive. You need to download the data, probably an SSD. Will be more effective. I mean, this is interesting because by the time this goes out, I assume 2 days from when we're recording it, the new mining system will be in place, and that's going to move a lot of the work from CPU power to storage. Right. So we'll be stressing the link between the hard drive, or SSD most likely, and the CPU is kind of a core part of the work mechanism. But you don't have to stake a huge amount. You don't have to have massive amounts of RAM. I think basically 8 gigs of RAM or something. I think you can actually get it working on 4, but you have to do some little hacks to do that. But not huge amounts of RAM. You need a competitive CPU, right? The more you invest, the more you're going to earn on that front. And the same with SSDs. So the more, there's going to be a ratio basically of expenditure on CPU and hard disks. So the more you spend on CPU, you're also going to have to spend on multiple replicas of the data. Otherwise, you're just going to saturate that link between the two pieces that are required to do the work puzzle. It's pretty easy, frankly, relative to the others. You don't have to wait around and get like assigned contracts or anything like that. There's no reputation. You just replicate as much of the data as you can, which is what the node will do by default. And if you're being really smart about it, you probably modify the node to look for data that other people aren't replicating so much, because you get a slightly higher reward for that. That gives the network a sort of auto leveling effect. I'm not sure if anyone's actually done it yet, but it is the most effective way to mine Arweave. So yeah, from that point of view, it's very easy. And in terms of, if you're a developer and you want to get involved, I think the community is exceptionally open. You just come along and start talking to people and develop a Discord server. In like 5 minutes, you'll have some interesting ideas to go hack on. And people will respond to all your questions like promptly. And I think there's a good body of knowledge there about like how to build applications. And for what it's worth, I think Arweave is probably one of the more forward-thinking communities when it comes to like UX. In fact, the developers building applications, all they talk about when they come to me is like, hey, how do we make this UX better? How do we make it so that the people can get on board with the ecosystem easier? And so we got like Phil led this effort between the all the founders that we've invested in as the core Arweave team. We have this little channel we call the Founders Circle. Phil sent out a post there that said, hey guys, let's get together and let's talk about how we can get like fiat on-ramps to Arweave tokens more easily. And so they had a call and just organized basically, I think 3 methods in the end. The ramp, transact, and also Verto are working on one, which we won't front run, but it's going to be pretty cool. Yeah, and by the end of this call, basically had 3 options ready to go. But there's also like Weave ID, which is an interesting one that allows you to use your username and password set up just like Web 2, but they're encrypting the key file and storing the key file on the network. Downside, obviously, key recovery is not so easy, right? You can't just say, I've forgotten my password. But if you can get over that hurdle, it's a much easier experience. Yeah, so I think that the people in the network generally really care about UX. And I think that's going to serve us well over the next like 2 to 3 years as we see real adoption of decentralized web technologies in like the mainstream.
Sure. And just going back again to something you mentioned earlier about, the economic model is basically pay once as an endowment, and that will pay for your storage in perpetuity. Can you just explain a little bit more how that works and how people are, or the kind of the miners, I guess, or people running nodes are incentivized long term to remain around and store that data once they've already been paid? Yeah,
well, of course, I mean, you don't already pay them. That's the critical thing.
Right.
So when you put a piece of information into the network, you're paid a small amount, like I think it's 14%.
Right.
Goes to the miner that found the block. That's an additional cost. We call that the block inclusion incentive. Because the problem is if you don't have that, there's not actually an incentive to include transactions in the block. Because most of the reward comes from, at least once the inflation levels off, most of the reward comes from the storage endowment. So basic principle is you pay for 200 years worth of storage up front, which is like actually pretty cheap. It's ½ cent per megabyte because storage is just not expensive nowadays. Yeah, you pay for 200 years worth of storage. It goes into the pool, and then over time, relative to the real storage cost of the present day, those tokens are released.
Right.
And so this has like a supply constraining effect on the network, but then the supply slowly inches up again as you release tokens to reward people for storing stuff. Okay,
and just quickly, just last point on this, and so if someone's coming in to act as a miner, what's the value to them at the moment? How profitable is it for them to contribute?
Right now, there's a lot of competition, I think. I mean, mining is always an interesting point in crypto networks, because like ultimately the mechanism design is built such that all of the miners compete until the opportunity cost, you're basically down to zero margin. Like you should compete to remove all of the profit from it. And then you have this natural tendency that like some of the miners are like, I'm not making any money here. And they turn off their machines. And that creates a little bit more of an opportunity, and it ebbs and flows. So it's like it's an elegant mechanism design and elegant economics, but interestingly quite unfortunate for community development because people are inevitably disappointed because that's actually just how the system works. You can't really get around it. However, so there's high competition right now, but 2 days from now, when the new mining algorithm kicks in, I think most of the current miners will probably disappear, which means that I can't promise, but my guess is that it'll be a great time to plug in a machine and start mining with your hard drive, because all the old miners were set up for CPU mining essentially, and the new mining system just won't match the hardware they already own, so they just won't carry over. I'm expecting there to be a small gold rush, but that's just my theory. It could be completely wrong.
Yeah, well, we've seen it before. I mean, these things tend to be cyclical. It's no different from Bitcoin mining. You have your fallow periods and your very profitable periods, which you're probably going through at the moment for Bitcoin miners. But
Right.
yeah, all interesting stuff. So thanks for kind of answering those questions.
And just to tack on to that real quick around the mining, the other interesting thing happening in the community is there's other node software that people are coming out with that also incentivizes you to run. So you can not just mine Arweave, but you could, run an Amplify node. You can run an OpenCoi node, and get different tokens for running that type of server. That all benefit the Arweave network.
Yeah.
So that's pretty cool from my perspective.
Yeah, I think the Amplify network, the testnet should be live in like a few weeks, and that will be very profitable, I'm guessing, in the early days. This is actually like, Phil, you came along way early in the beginning days of mining Arweave when it was super profitable. There's always this sort of gold rush at the beginning. I think we're seeing that on a couple of fronts at the moment in Arweave. Yeah, or at least on the horizon.
Well, we'll keep our eye out, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of opportunities for people to get involved. So just conscious on time here. Phil, what have you got on your roadmap, and what's the other big ideas you've got in your head? Which I'm sure there's a few. If you haven't already got enough on your plate, but what do you think is having visibility of the broad network? What do you think are the next critical areas that you think, if it's not you and your team, but other teams, would probably do best to look at in terms of filling critical gaps?
Yeah. Well, I mean, just since we just mentioned it, the new gateway software that's being worked on called Amplify, that should definitely help from a serving data perspective on the network. Right now, sure, you can upload your data to all the nodes, but getting it back really quickly, reliably is a bit centralized, because you can only kind of rely on the very few gateways that are out there. But that's all about to be changed. So I think that's going to be a huge boon for the network and all the apps that are being hosted there. For ArDrive, we're already looking at running our own gateway, just so we can kind of tune it just for our data. Just in the next couple of months, we really want to release our native mobile app, our desktop application. Right, we just expanded the team as well to kind of work on the next bigger things. Right, we're trying to go through a rebranding of our user experience, right? Make it easier to get the users in, tie in that fiat on-ramp piece that we were just speaking about. Down the line, it's just introducing a lot of features, right? We want to at least get it to reasonable parity with the file sync apps that you probably use today, right? So for example, right now, when you create a drive, you can make it public or private. You can share those files, but you can't collaborate at the same time. So we want to introduce, public and private drive collaboration. We want to have things like image thumbnails, right? If you're going to upload your photos forever, it's going to get tough to view them after a while. So having nice thumbnails, and again, going back to a good user experience would help. It would be awesome to introduce one of the new social protocols that seems like every other week there's some new protocol being written on the network, but we should go more than just sharing the files, right? If you're the owner of this data, maybe you get rewarded for people who view it. Maybe we integrate with some of the new NFT tokens being built on Arweave. So just explore some of the social pieces. And then there's just big stuff like search, right? That's something that I think, Sam, correct me if I'm wrong, there's some indexing of content on there, but it doesn't seem to be specifically tailored for Arweave. So that's something where, there might be an ArDrive search, by the end of this year. So you can find all your data, right? Even if it is private. That's one of the key things, is if you have private data, nobody else can see it. So something like search would have to work, where you're kind of indexing your own data and only you can search through that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sam?
Yeah, you can use bit search, which is indexing the network, like a kind of Google Lite, if you will, with less tracking. But it's certainly that there's ways to expand on that. I think one of the interesting things the base layer protocol does is it just exposes the ability to arbitrarily tag any piece of data as you wish, to give it arbitrary metadata. And this is what gave rise to the ability to like build decentralized Twitter or something like this on top of Arweave. Because without, if you just have content addressing, you can say there is a file, it has this name. But you can't say anything else about it. You can't say, hey, give me all the files that X. Which is really powerful. I think there's ways to expand on those search engines like BitSearch, so you can actually cover those tags as well. And then you have this really interesting thing that's like a web of deeply associated or deeply categorized information. That could be super, super powerful. And you have that built into the base protocol. Someone just needs to expose it. Someone just needs to expose it via a nice user interface, essentially.
Yeah, so you've got this upgrade coming this week. You were saying just before the call that you feel like the community is really kind of gaining traction, and it feels a bit like you're kind of less hands-on than you've had to be the last few years, trying to keep up on top of what people are doing. With all that flying, what is your next focus going to be over the next year, and what is it that you really want to kind of find time to work on?
Yeah, I think it's certainly not less hands-on. I feel I'm busier than ever, but now the nature of the job has changed. Yeah. Like it used to be that nothing would happen without us, the centralized core team, trying to like nudge it into existence, essentially. But now it's the exact opposite. It's just like, okay, all of this stuff is happening anyway. What's the best way that we can apportion our time and resources to back the founders normally, but sometimes just community members that are building great stuff or doing great stuff, useful things for the ecosystem? How can we best support them? And it's more like putting fuel on an existing and growing fire than trying to light the fire at this point. So what we see our job as now is, and I think one of the ways we can really add value is just being the investor sort of connector for a lot of these early stage projects. And so we run series we call the Open Web Foundry, which is basically a kind of incubator program where we take founders with good ideas and we take them through the process of like getting established as a project and get them to their first capital. That allows them to basically like Phil, quit their job, start this full time, which is happening for more and more people in the ecosystem. It's just like incredibly fulfilling to watch, I think. Let's see. I think that's ultimately the way we can add value at this point. Really just those things are like connecting the founders with great mentors, advice, capital, as well as providing some of the capital ourselves. I like to try and evangelize for the ecosystem as much as I can, like shout about it, say, isn't it cool that someone is doing this thing? Be the kind of amplifier, if you will. But really the job has very much changed from this like bootstrapping mode where we were more like a startup. Now, like right at the beginning, we were just like a dev team, like a group of hackers with laptops trying to build the network in the first place. And then we had this bootstrapping function, which is broadly over now. Now it's mostly just capital allocation, resource allocation. That's the kind of focus.
Nice. Letting your baby fly on its own.
Right. Yeah. Well, really crazy to watch, to be honest. But yeah.
Well, look, guys, it's been, thank you for joining us, and it's been excellent to hear about all these different facets of the project, and especially Phil, hearing like firsthand from your perspective of what the experience has been like to start building on Arweave. If people want to get involved, what's the best resources they should go to? I mean, obviously the website, but what other channels and community channels have you got that people should join?
Yeah, so the website is the kind of like core hub, and we're upgrading that recently, maybe by the time you hear this. So arweave.org is a place to go, and then from there you want to take a link to the Arweave developer Discord and just say hi, and someone else will come along and they will introduce you to the ecosystem and tell you about all the interesting things you can do. And if you just drop an idea there, someone is bound to come along and say, hey, someone's already thought about this part of it, you should go and look at that, but there's this space still available to explore. Other than that, we're starting another round of the Open Web Foundry, I think in 2 weeks. So starting early March. And that's open enrollment. So even if you're watching later, anytime in the next 6 weeks or so, you can just come along to that, get involved, and then we invest essentially at the end in projects sort of proportionally, or giving out our capital as best we think we can to support the ecosystem. But really, that's, we give out 100K each time we do one of these things in investments. But that's nothing relative to what you can get from the open market, and that is really our job. We see as like in introducing great projects, great founders to investors. And so, like the last open web incubator we ran, we invested 100K, but the free market invested something like 1.5 million after it was over. So this is really like, look, if you have a great idea for a Web3 project, come along. We will help you quit your job and make it your full-time thing. And you can own all of the upside. That's the approach right now. So
seems like a good pitch. Where do I sign up?
Great. And Phil, maybe you can tell us where we can find out more about ArDrive.
Yeah, Phil.
Yeah, well, definitely. I think there might be a link from the arweave.org site, but you can always go to ardrive.io, ardrive.io. We have a Discord as well for technical communication, whatnot. I mean, we're always looking for passionate people who, enjoy building cool things. Whether it's not too technical, like community building, or even if you're a developer. I mean, we're always looking for bright individuals. So check us out. Message me.
Yeah. Hopefully some people do. Guys, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you today. Wishing you best of luck with the upgrade this week, and for all the exciting developments that it sounds like you have on your roadmap. So wishing you the very, very best of luck.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.